Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our weekly study today. And we are in the book of Judges, chapter 7, and we're picking up at verse 15. And just a quick recap is that this man chosen by God to be a judge, his name is Gideon, is having some fears, some misgivings, and he puts out fleeces or little tests, if you will, before God to find out, just to make sure that he's doing the right thing and that God is with him. And we see how God, in his mercy, answered that. And so, last episode, we left off with Gideon and this person, his servant, and going with him into the camp of um, hundreds of thousands of people and spying on them. And the Lord let him hear a dream that one of the men had, and it obviously gave encouragement to Gideon. I believe his servant that was with him also was like a theophany or a manifestation of God's presence that also gave him um, this confidence. And so in verse 15, we're going to see what kind of impact it has on Gideon. And so we get to verse 15, as hopefully you can see on your screen, and it says, "And it was so that when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation thereof, he worshipped." And this word "worshipped" is very interesting because depending upon what denomination you are affiliated with, this word "worship" can have many different ways of being practiced in your denomination or in your church. For some, it's a quiet. We have worship services where there's singing. Some churches that are more Pentecostal, charismatic type, there can be all instruments playing, a lot of singing, clapping, raising of hands, people even dancing in the spirit, and showing a lot of emotion. And then other churches, which are maybe not so demonstrative, um, worship is a little bit harder to identify and harder to figure out. But what's evident here is that the Bible felt it necessary to put in that Gideon worshiped. And of course, remember where he's at. He's sitting next to a guy's tent and overhearing what just happened there, and he's feeling pretty good about it, but yet, he's not going to make any noise or everybody's going to rise up and know that he's there. So this can't be worship the way we maybe ascribe worship. I'm going to take a quick look into the Hebrew, and what you're seeing on your screen now is the Bible Hub with the Hebrew transliteration, and you'll see that this word "worshipped" has a number of 7812 over. That's the Hebrew designation. Every Hebrew word in the Bible has a number um, so that it can be looked up and studied. So we're going to click on that and bring out the hyperlink, and it comes up with the word "shachach," which means to bow down. Very simple, not a lot of explanation there. It's translated, worship, bow down, many different ways in our English, but the true source and true root of this word is basically just to bow down, to bow your knees down to the ground. And so we can see that this is what Gideon did here is he just dropped to his knees. Doesn't give any indication that he said anything, although I'm sure in his heart there were words being said, but he dropped to his knees. And of course, that is just an interesting understanding of what worship means and how does God look at worship, and what does it mean to bow your knee to something? Is it, I know that we lack the full understanding of what it means to live in a country of idolatry and country of pagan worship where bowing the knee was showing reverence, it was showing obeisance, and it was the form of humbling yourself and lowering yourself before someone that you identified as a superior, as a greater, as someone who was you were being subservient to. It was putting yourself in a subservient position. And so it had a much different meaning back then than maybe what we ascribe to it now. And what Gideon was just acknowledging is that God was in control and that God was taking care of everything. And he submitted himself and humbled himself by bowing his knee. And it looks from there, he was encouraged, didn't need any more encouragement, no matter what the situation would bring about. And he runs back to where the Israelites were encamped, and he yells to them, "Get up, for the Lord has delivered into your hands the host of Midian." But remember, he's only got 300 guys to wake up. And he divided them in verse 16 into three companies of 100 each, and got them ready for their battle plan. And here's where we have to read in a little bit. Another thing that's noticed here is that, where is this guy Purah? Where's the guy that went with him into the camp? We never hear of him again. And it in my spirit, I was just had a memory here to something that happened way back in chapter 6, where a similar thing happened, and I wondered if they maybe couldn't be related. But when the angel of the Lord first appeared to Gideon in chapter 6, verse 21, Gideon went and, was all excited and prepared this feast, which is a form of worship, a form of giving offering, and came and brought it before this angel, although he maybe didn't quite know it was an angel. And so he prepared this meal, put it before the angel. The angel took the staff that he was carrying, touched the food and the sacrifice, the offering that he brought, and poof, it goes up into flame and disappears. And when that worship offering was accepted, it said that the angel also vanished from his sight. And I just thought, well, maybe there's a parallel here, that this guy, this manifestation of God, Pua, was with Gideon until the point that he worshiped, until he dropped to his knee. And then this man disappeared, this angel disappeared. And whatever it was, we don't know for certain, but it certainly bolstered Gideon's confidence. And also in between here is somewhere Gideon got a battle plan. Gideon got a mode of how to operate, because remember, he's got 300 guys going against tens, if not hundreds of thousands. What was he supposed to do? Did he know what he needed to do? I think somewhere in here, God intervened and spoke to him, and maybe it was Pua told him that before he disappeared. But however that happened, Gideon comes back confident and gets to verse 17 and says, "Here's what I'm going to do. Look at me and do what I do. I want you to take a trumpet. I want you to take a pitcher. And when I blow the trumpets on take a pitcher and a lamp, put a lamp or a candle, if you will, something that's illuminated inside of these pitchers. And when we get out there, I'm going to blow the trumpet, and everybody who's with me, I want you to blow your trumpets, and I want you to say," and this is where we're going to take a look at, say, "the sword of the Lord and of Gideon." Well, when you look at that, it matches pretty much if you drop down to verse 20, when they get there and they cried, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." But in the Hebrew Bible, verse 18 is different. And so if we jump ahead in the Hebrew to verse 18, we see that the words say, um, Vayamartem, and say, La Yahweh and Ve Gideon. It and in parentheses here you see the words "the sword of," and so the original Hebrew does not say "the sword of the Lord and of Gideon." It just says, "and say to the Lord," and this is what the lamed here is actually a preposition that means to, say to Yahweh and to Gideon. And so what's interesting here is, why did they have to include Gideon? Why was Gideon's name implied here? You would think you'd want all the um, glory to go to God, as we're always instructed of. And they were probably carrying swords with them. That was pretty much a no-brainer. But I think it was also that they wanted to convey the understanding that God was in charge and handling this, but that he also is working through a man. Had it not been for Gideon, none of this would be happening. And so also, because they are dealing with the Midianites, who were pagan people, they didn't know who Yahweh was. They didn't know who the Lord was. They followed only men and only leaders. And so this is emphasizing again that God's hand is upon Gideon. So you'll see that little difference there. And of course, the translators in English, to keep continuity, need to put the sword in here, because otherwise it wouldn't have made sense to them. But in the Hebrew, it makes perfect sense, and we get a better understanding that they're not leaning upon the sword of the Lord, but of God's method and of what Gideon is doing at God's direction. So we get to verse 19, and it says they took the 100 men with them, and then there were other two groups of each of 100 men. And then they talk about what timing, they talk about the beginning of the middle watch, and it says they had set a new watch. What this was is a change of the guard, that they had, some commentators say 3 watches, some say 4 watches, either broken into time spans of 3 hours each or 4 hours each. And so they say this middle watch was the time, roughly about midnight, when the changing of the guard was going to take place. So there was a new group coming. The ones that had been sitting there for 3 hours got replaced by a brand new set. And so they're saying this was probably a great time when they didn't have their act together yet. They were just maybe asleep. They're waking up, taking their posts, kind of in a drowsy state of mind. Remember, it's dark outside, it's midnight. And it was at this time that Gideon and his men blew their trumpets, broke the pitchers that had their lamps in them so the lights could shine forth. And the 3 companies did this on either side. And then, of course, verse 20, they said they cried the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And if we look at the Hebrew in verse 20, um, that they did cry out, sword of the Lord. The word sword is in there, of charev. And so, kind of interesting, did they obey or did they disobey? And did they kind of falter a little bit here to talk about the method of perishing that they had control of, and that was the sword? And it doesn't say that God got angry with them, doesn't say that, oh, suddenly their whole mission has failed because they kind of cried out the wrong thing. We see here in verse 21 that everybody in the camp was bewildered. Uh, they cried, they fled in verse 20, and then as they blew their trumpets, it looks like they all kind of went berserk and started fighting against each other. So all the Midianites started fighting against each other. And of course, remember, it's midnight. They're woken from a sleep. All they hear are the trumpets blasting. They see the lights. How did God magnify this and amplify this so that it just terrified them? Again, I think that's part of the miracle here of what God did to allow this victory, this great victory, to take place. So remembering it's at midnight, but these people were running in the darkness. The Midianites fled in verse 22 um, to Zareth and on to Tabeth. And the other Israelites, remember, there were like 20, 30 some thousand who didn't get selected to go along. They must have been on standby, because they gathered themselves together out of Naphtali, out of Asher, out of Manasseh, and pursued the Midianites. And then verse 24 says that Gideon sent messengers all around Ephraim, and they also came and came against them. Now, this part of verse 24, you'll have to remember, because it sets the stage for chapter 8 when we come back next week, because there's going to be a little altercation here between Gideon and the men of Ephraim over what had happened here. And so we do see that Gideon did invite them, and they did come along. And but this battle must have taken hours until daylight came. Or could it have been that the Midianites were running in the dark, bumping into the cities and tents of Israel? And so then the men that were sleeping awoke and fought themselves and protected themselves. we must assume that this took longer than the 6 hours until daylight came, because they chased them and they took the two princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb. They met untimely ends and they lost their lives, and their heads were trophies that were brought to Gideon on the other side of Jordan. So again, just a fantastic story. We look at the map again and we see where Gideon is taking his battle. It's up here near the River Jordan. You see that Manasseh is here, but uh, the Ephraimites are down a little bit further south. Obviously, it takes time for them to get there and be a part of this battle plan. And so, just many things we don't fully understand, but we do know that God worked a great miracle. God worked the battle and delivered them, and He was glorified in all of it because it was beyond their own strength. So, hope you enjoyed that story and take encouragement from it and know that God is always able to do exceedingly abundantly above anything that we can ask or think, or about any problems that we may have. So God bless you and look forward to seeing you next week. Bye bye.